Good morning, Dan. And in for Amy this morning is the equally leggy Pat Hughes, founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project, former U.S. Senate candidate, Republican U.S. Senate candidate back in 2010. And I've got a simple question for you, Pat, and for our friends and listening audience. Is Hillary Clinton a bigot? 312-642-5600 turnkey.pro answer line, 64636DA turnkey.pro text line. Trump says that Hillary Clinton is bigoted, that she supports bigoted policies. Is that a fair statement to make?
I think that it is. John Cass did a great column in the Trib on Sunday about this very thing. The policies that Democrats have put forth in the last 40 years nationally, and of course, Dan, in our state of Illinois, in CPS, in the city of Chicago, have done absolutely nothing to help the overall condition of the lives of minority communities, specifically African Americans and Hispanics, like, for example, in Chicago. And they've done a lot to foster crime, single-parent homes, despair, lack of opportunity. And it's all been done to make sure that the group of folks continue to vote Democrat. And so from that perspective, putting forth policies that you know are wrong over and over and over again to get votes for your own agenda, yeah, I'd say that that's a fair statement.
Well, the data is very compelling. You put someone on welfare, you have a very good chance to convert them to being a Democrat voter. That's what's happened in particular in urban centers. You get someone off welfare, the changes their perspective on public policy. It doesn't mean they all become Republicans. Somebody that was on welfare, they get off welfare, they're voting Republican. It's not that, but it is not nearly the advantage that Democrats have among that demographic. Dependents, overwhelmingly Democrat. People living independent lives, much more mixed, like the general public. And so you're going to, if your focus is the pursuit of power, which it is for the left, and frankly, many Republicans too, but it absolutely is for the left, the government-directed society that the left promotes, then you look at the numbers, and everybody crunches numbers. You know, this every person's a snowflake stuff is nice on the campaign trail, but they crunch numbers, as you know, Pat. And you say, well, here's where our biggest advantage is. So we need to continue to exploit that advantage. And the way you exploit that advantage is to make more people dependent. So you choose, individuals have to choose. They're responsible for their own choices. But the choice in urban centers is increasingly live life as a suburban, or exist as a subservient Democrat, or live an independent life. That's your choice. It's real. We had Walter Williams on the show not so long ago, and there's few people, like Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, there's just a handful of people in this rarefied space, this rarefied intellectual space. Few people have written more on topic and more persuasively on topic. They're both economics professors, have done the research to back up their contentions with data than Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell. Walter Williams, we asked, are those policies that have been imposed on the country writ large via the welfare state and urban centers in particular, are they bigoted? He wouldn't go there. He wouldn't use the term bigoted. And he has much more standing to talk about these issues than I do, and much more mental capacity than I do. But I'm going to gently disagree and say that they are. Maybe it's not specifically race, it's economic station in life and the desire to keep people down and dependent regardless of race. So it's not bigoted in the sense it's just focusing on black families or Latino families. It's anybody we can remove the soul from via the welfare state. That's what we want to do because they become our voter.
Yeah, and politically, Dan, we've been beating up a little bit on Trump today, and deservedly so for some of the stuff that he's done. But, Republicans, and I'm a Republican, you're a Republican, when we're affiliated to that party, do a terrible job of messaging to minority communities, mostly because they're afraid of being called racists. And Trump has done a great job of saying something that needs to be said, that the policies that have been put in place, particularly in America's big cities, all run by Democrats, Dan, with terrible poverty, terrible crime, terrible schools all across our country. He's done a good job of putting this front and center. I read a piece by Donna Brazil, the interim DNC chair, where she said that he'll never get Democrat votes because Republicans haven't done anything for Democrats over the years, not a mention of any of the circumstances that are facing minorities in our inner cities, in big cities, because they just want to ignore that problem and hope it goes away.
I'm glad you brought that up because this is some interesting additional evidence to present for consideration. Christian Science Monitor, U.S.'s most economically segregated schools aren't where you might expect. Only one southern state made the top 10 list. Economic segregation, as Kevin Williamson writes in National Review, like racial segregation, is a condition that certainly exists in the South, but it is much more pronounced in our large Democrat-dominated northeastern metros and West Coast cities such as San Francisco, where the spotlessly progressive municipal authorities have for a generation used restrictive zoning laws to drive out the sort of people who aren't on a first-name basis with any venture capitalists. And he, goes through major urban centers. I live in Chicago. You're obviously a suburbanite, but you well-versed in Chicago, and you know what's happened in Chicago. You know the de facto segregation in the schools and in the neighborhoods that exist in Chicago, particularly in the schools you mentioned. 60 years after Brown v. Board of Education, has that promise been realized? 90% of CPS is minority and on free or reduced school lunch, poor. So has that been realized? I don't think so. In San Francisco, data. In 1970, there were 100,000 African Americans in San Francisco. 1990, 78,000. Today, 51,000. There is a great deal more to what ails the poor and long-suffering African American communities than housing policy, writes Kevin Williamson, and he's right about that. Here's something else that's interesting. Thomas Sowell, going back to one of the other great contributors to this discussion for the last half century, the difference in philosophy when it comes to talking about crime in the inner cities. And this was demonstrated during the unrest in Milwaukee a couple weeks ago. The police chief of the city of Milwaukee versus our friend, Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clark, and looking for root causes. Flynn looking for root causes. Clark looking to enforce the law.
Right.
And in terms of root causes, Sowell writes, the hard fact is that the murder rate in the country as a whole was going down during those very decades when social problems in the slums were supposedly being neglected. Homicide rates among black males went down 18% in the 1940s and by 22% in the 1950s. It was in the 1960s, when the ideas of Chief Justice Warren and others triumphed, that this long decline in homicide rates among black males reversed and skyrocketed by 89%, wiping out all the progress of the previous 20 years. That's the introduction of the Great Society, which turned out to be not so great. The same reversal in the country at large saw murder rates by 1974 more than twice as high as in 1960. This was after the murder rate had been cut in half from where it had been in the 1930s. Ghetto riots, which erupted in the 60s, were blamed on poverty and discrimination, but what were the facts? Poverty and discrimination were worse in the South than the rest of the country, but ghetto riots were not nearly as common in the South. And he goes through the data to support those contentions, which turn out to be true. And this is the tragedy of what has come to pass in our urban centers, the predatory big government policies, as I describe them, is that you saw literacy rates and safety rates, if you will, the decrease in violent crime, or the incidence of violent crime, better during Jim Crow, when we had institutional racism and de jure segregation, than after 45 years of Great Society programs. Is there a bigger indictment of those programs? And if you're unwilling to rethink and recast those programs, then what does it say about you? You don't care about the evidence, and even more importantly, you don't care about the people who have suffered at the hands of predatory big government. And that's what Trump is referencing, I believe, when he calls Hillary Clinton a bigot. And I think he's absolutely right to do so. Dan in Lake Forest, you're on Chicago's Morning Answer.
Good morning.
Morning.
To be a bigot, you're intolerant of others' views, and you probably stick to what you believe. Hillary's worse than that. She's a demagogue who preys on prejudices and the ignorance of her constituents, and she's a charlatan who swindles everybody through deception. So she's worse than a bigot. She engages in trickery and swindles people and does whatever it takes to stay in power. So Trump's not only right, But she's a lot worse than that, and the media doesn't let people see how evil this woman really is.
Thanks, Dan. George in Will County.
Good morning, Dan and Pat. Thanks for taking the call.
Morning.
Yes, Democrat policies are bigoted, and we already know because we heard that from Lyndon Johnson. What did he say? I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 40 years. Why did he say that? Because he knew as soon as he was able to create dependency that that level will continue to be there, and they will have to vote for them in order to continue their reign. Now, here's the problem. As conservatives, we need to start honestly putting forth people that will be able to say, look, school choice is the way to go. My child was here in this school. They are doing a lot better. They now have opportunities just like President Obama's kids do, just like Jesse Jackson Jr.'s children did, just like Al Sharpton has done for his family members. How do you get out of this system? You have to educate people. And if we don't talk about the information that Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams have put forth and literally expound upon that in these urban communities, we can't do it on TV in front of majority white audiences at these locations. We need people like Trump. We need people like you guys to spend more time in the black community with people standing there to be able to give testimony.
Yeah, thanks for the call, George. I appreciate it. And here's what happens when you change public policy. You change opinions. So Florida is a great example. The tax credit scholarship program that was launched under Jeb Bush and continued under Rick Scott. Rick Scott's reelection for governor 2 years ago against that oleaginous trial lawyer, Charlie Crist, who's been a member of every political party that exists in the Western world. One of the dividers between the two, Rick Scott, I'm going to continue that tax credit scholarship program that has provided opportunities for so many children, in particular minority children in some of Florida's urban centers. Charlie Crist, beholden to the teachers union, I'm going to discontinue it and pour that money into, our public school systems and so forth. Well, here's the problem that Charlie Crist had and found out the hard way. Well, that program had been in existence for a number of years because it dated back to Jeb Bush. So it created a constituency because families were benefiting from the scholarships available.
Liked it.
Right. And they said, you're going to take away my kid's scholarship to go to good school? No, you're not. Rick Scott's percentage of the black vote in his reelection campaign as compared to the first time he ran, plus 12%.
That's because Charlie Crist was listening to the teachers unions and not the people who were part of that process. Dan, one of the interesting things about this too is because just what you said about Sowell and about Williams and just about Rick Scott. This is evidence. This is data. That's why Hillary Clinton. That's why her response is to call Donald Trump a racist. That's why Democrats call Republicans racist, because it's the only response that they have. The policy prescriptions that they've done overwhelmingly do not serve their constituency in those communities. And so the only thing they can do is do the ad hominem. That's all they can do. And that's why they do it over and over again.
Yeah, it's a misdirection play because of, having to be held to account for what has actually happened with their policies implemented. That's precisely it. We'll take more of your calls after this. Dan, and in for Amy is Pat Hughes from the Illinois Opportunity Project. We're talking about Trump's overt appeal to minority families, his discussion of policies that have negatively impacted our urban centers, and his description of Hillary Clinton as a bigot. Taking your calls. Let's go to Glenn in Naperville. You're on Chicago's Morning Answer.
Hey, good morning. I just wanted to say that if you want to position a message to the black community from conservatives and Republicans, you cannot keep saying we want to take our country back. Because if you're black, you don't want to go back to where they were. Whites always look at the black community and say, look how far we've come since slavery. And the black community looks and says, we have so much farther to go.
Yeah.
Where are we going from here?
Point.
Do not tread on these signs. Those are from slavery times. You got to reposition the visuals and the message.
All right, Glenn. That's I don't disagree with that. And
Very good point.
As a great man once said, words are the currency of politics. So the words that you choose matter. You know who said that?
That had to be you.
Yeah, that's right. Great man. Verlin on the south side, of course. Hey, Verlin.
Oh, well, how y'all doing today, man? Y'all been so informative all week that I'm just been happy sitting back and listening to you.
All right, Verlin.
And then I was scared to call you Tuesday. I wanted to call Tuesday, but the way you took John from Mongoloid to task, I said, no, I'm not calling Dan today. He's not in a good mood. But short and sweet, though, I am so glad that Trump has honed in on the bigoted aspect of Hillary. From all of these Democratic policies, which they try to flip it on the conservatives and say you're racist because they don't want you to succeed, but yet they're keeping people dependent. I just want, when the first debate to come, I want him to go all the way back 40 years and home in on how she was a bigot in the beginning and been a bigot all this time so people can truly understand who's the racist, not these insensitive words that he might have said. No, who's the true racist? And this is what I've been hoping for so long. Thank you.
Thanks, Verlin. Yeah, and that gets them back on their heels like it did Hillary in the primary when Bernie Sanders pulled this old chestnut out and accused Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton of being racist when they had their first go-around in the White House.
Not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
So I think actually Trump has a bit of an opportunity to do a pincer movement on Hillary Clinton from the right and the left.